Now, we're very happy to have Dr. Bob Birmingham here with us tonight. Bob is the former Wisconsin archaeologist and professor, state archaeologist, and professor at the University of Wisconsin-Waukesha. He is the author of several books on Wisconsin history and archaeology. Dr. Birmingham has been researching Wisconsin fur trade history for several decades, and especially that of the Prairie du Chien, Madeline Island, and Chequamegon Bay. So I'm looking forward to this. Let's have a big hand for Dr. Birmingham. No, I'll get it for you.
That's okay. No, that's all right. Yeah, the title of my lecture was Furs, Fish, and Missions, dealing with a time period between the 1600s and about 1850. Perhaps the most dramatic period in Chequamegon Bay history, and probably the most dramatic period and place in the upper Midwest during that time. I mean, Chequamegon Bay area is absolutely remarkable, and that extraordinary nature was observed even at the time. Henry Schoolcraft, some of you may recognize that name. Henry Schoolcraft was an explorer, a government agent, a writer of great note, married an Ojibwa lady, but when he came through in 1822, he later wrote, "I have heard much of the ancient Chippewa capital of La Pointe." Now, La Pointe is what largely people in those days referred to this whole area. They didn't call it Chequamegon as much as they called it La Pointe. As the French call it, or Chequamegon in Lake Superior, situated near its west end. The Chippewas and their friends, the old traders and Bois Brule and Canadians are never tired of talking about it. All of the great men of former times are located here. It was here that their Mudgee Kiwis, king or chief ruler, lived. And as some relate, that a sacred fire was kept up within a crude temple. So that is one view of your home in 1822 as a very remarkable place. This is another map of the area that we're looking at, of course, and you can see Washburn, Madeline. Many of these areas had very famous roles in the history of the Lake Superior area. Next slide. Of course, from time immemorial, the Ojibwa occupied this area in as far as native people go. Native peoples have lived in Chequamegon Bay area for thousands of years. And probably in about the 1600s, the Ojibwa, or Chippewa, as they were called earlier, migrated to the area from the west. In oral traditions, they came from the Great Salt Sea, and eventually through time migrated across and then came here where La Pointe or Chequamegon became their sort of capital, as Schoolcraft had pointed out. And from here, Ojibwa bands, as population grew, migrated into the interior of Wisconsin and Minnesota, setting up settlements there. that in many places are reservations today. Next. Now, why was Chequamegon area so attractive? In the late 1600s, or mid 1600s, we have thousands and thousands of native people coming to here from distant places as far as Illinois to spend short periods of time. Given the weather, I can see why, right? It's like California today. And the reason is the particular environment of Chequamegon Bay. Let's see, could you go to the next slide? Let's see. No, go back 2 slides, actually. Can you go back 2 slides? And 1 more slide. The particular environment of Chequamegon Bay, which is unique along the south shore of Lake Superior, and so unique that it brought together a cluster of resources that are unparalleled. Now you can go to the fish. And one of them is well known to you, of course, is fish. But it's the nature of the fish, and when they could be caught, that lent some specialness to the area. Top one, of course, is sturgeon. Sturgeon are... Okay. Are we talking to the mic? Can everybody hear? All right. Okay, I'm going to start over.
Sturgeon.
Be careful what you ask for. Sturgeon, bottom dwellers normally, but they come up rivers in the spring to spawn. How many people have seen a sturgeon? Yeah, I mean, these are huge fish. In some cases can be like 7 feet long, supply enormous amount of meat. However, they spawn in spring, and they come up rivers, and what native people did were to build what they call fish weirs, wooden structures from which they could spear the sturgeon as they're coming up. I mean, they're hard to miss up the rivers. The most famous fish weir was, in fact, at Bad River, on the Bad River Reservation. Now, why this is a valuable resource is not just because of the food, but when it occurs. Because in spring, nothing else is available to eat. And in other places, people go through a period of, well, starvation or famine. But here in Chequamegon Bay, you've got fish fries for a long time, you know. So in spring, there is an abundance of food resources. As you know, also whitefish and lake trout, very popular food, even today. And Native American people also fished for these, but in a different way. Because these fish do not come up rivers to spawn. They come into shallower waters because they are deep water fish. So by shallower waters, however, is still pretty deep. Next slide. So the Native Americans 1,000 years ago developed something that is familiar to all of us today, gill nets that could be set underwater, and the fish, of course, come in and their gills get caught and so on. And then, you know, I don't know how the fishermen do it today, but every so often the nets are pulled up and the fish are taken. Now, what's interesting about this type of fishing is it occurs in fall. So you have an abundance of fish at 2 times a year. The early explorers, priests, and fur traders have mentioned over and over again, emphasized that people were coming to the shores of this bay, native people, because of the fish were so easy to catch. Next slide. And we find evidence, archaeological evidence, of this kind of fishing, the sturgeon fishing. The bone items on the lower, see, that would be your left, would be, these are harpoons, bone harpoons that would be attached to shafts. These would be used for the big sturgeon from the fish weirs. And these came from a site that I'll be talking about on Madeline Island, we found, that indicate sturgeon fishing. Not on Madeline Island, probably at Bad River, but these ended up at the site. And these are made of bone. Next slide. The animal life, mammals of Chequamegon Bay, consisted of moose and bear in terms of large animals, no deer in the past. This is all conifer forest before the logging industry changed everything. And so this was not good deer habitat. In fact, Ojibwa people who wanted deer had to travel down to mid-state where the deer would be found. But there was plenty of moose. And again, at one site on Madeline Island, we found, in fact, evidence of that in terms of moose bone. The little critter on the opposite side of the page is really one that attracted, besides the fish, many thousands of people beginning in the 1600s, and that's the beaver. And the beaver's pelts were the object of the fur trade. And beaver was plentiful in this area. Next slide. Wild rice. Wild rice is not common on the Lake Superior shore. It is common on interior lakes. But here, on a place called Cacogan Sloughs, again at Bad River, wild rice still grows. And the Bad River people still harvest it. But this is a photograph from the early 20th century of native people, Ojibwa, gathering wild rice. So another food, and it's available in September. Next slide. Maple sugar. Maple sugar syrup. During the 1820s and 1830s, people describe La Pointe on Madeline Island, this is before Bayfield and Washburn, being vacated in March, because everyone was going to the sugar, what they call sugar bushes, where the sugar maple were, and everyone was tapping the trees and making maple sugar and then eating it and having a great time. It was like a vacation, family reunion, and for the Ojibwa, a very religious thing too. But it was the highlight of the year. Can you imagine, right after winter? The first mild days, and now you're going on a camping trip, you know. And they made, sort of maple sugar cakes and so on. So that is in March. You can see how this is going here. We got food resources popping up throughout the year that were very important. Next slide. Corn agriculture. I just didn't have a good slide here. Oddly, the area around Chequamegon Bay has a 140-day growing season. Now, you're not farmers, I'm suspecting, so that might not mean much, but 140-degree growing days is what you need to grow corn. Anything less than that, you can't. About 10 miles south of here, you can't grow it. In northern Wisconsin in general, the growing season is not long enough to grow corn. You grow some potatoes and some other things, but it's not good agricultural climate. Now, why here? Well, because the what we call the lake effect. We have two peninsulas, Bayfield Peninsula, another peninsula there, and islands that are surrounded or semi-surrounded by water. And when you have a situation like that, the climate is moderated and the growing season is extended. So that doesn't occur, again, in other places on the south shore of Lake Superior. So you can grow corn. Now, where did they grow corn? Well, not everywhere. As all or most of you know, much of the land is heavy clay or beaches. And neither one of those are good places to grow, even if you could. Just not a good environment. What you need is a good fertile floodplain, good fertile soil. And where does that occur? Well, interestingly, where the Ojibwa traditionally had their cornfields, which was along the Bad River. And you can see how the Bad River is becoming a central part of the story. But again, we have another resource goes in with the rest of these to make Chequamegon Bay very attractive, very unique, and a place where you could live throughout the year without going very far because of the resources that are available. Next slide. And then you have other sorts of things like copious amounts of birch bark. In former days, that's what you made your boats out of. All your boats are made of birch bark. All your containers, even the containers that you use for sugar mapling, other sorts of things. So much so that probably a lot of native people, anyway, who were in this area, maybe even Ojibwa, didn't need to make pottery because they had birch bark all over the place. So another tremendous research. Next slide. Now within that environment then, we have new people starting to come to this area, attracted by all these favorable conditions, and as early as the early to mid 1600s, this was in the form of fur traders. They came for the beaver. Now, the French were the first, and the French colonies were at Quebec and Montreal. And the French gradually expanded. They needed more and more beaver pelts from Native Americans. Next slide. Why? To make hats. It sounds weird, but if the fashion in 1600s, 1700s, right up into the 1800s, every gentleman, every man in Europe had to have a beaver hat. And so fashion fueled a huge business, the fur trade. The pelts were gathered from native people and sent here, processed and sent here to make hats and other garments as well. Next slide. And in trade, the French and people after that, the English and the American fur traders, gave the Indians articles of European manufacture, items that the natives could not make themselves, and arguably made life quite a bit easier. For example, a wool blanket. The native people had, bear skins and so on, things like that, but wool blankets, exceptionally popular, as you can imagine. And metal kettles for cooking and so on replaced pottery and probably birch bark because they didn't wear out easily. But the metal kettles are usually made of brass or copper. And both the shininess, the copper especially element, was magical to native people. They had long associated, for example, copper and so on with magical qualities when they found it here. So oftentimes they cut up the kettles and made other things, ornaments, special ornaments, ritual or articles of personal decoration. They would trade for 2 pots, one to cook in and one to cut up and make other things because of the specialness of the metal. Guns, beads, especially trade beads, very popular. Knives were extremely valuable. Iron knives. The harpoons I showed you before, bone harpoons, became even more common after the fur trade because the natives now had iron knives in which to cut the bone. Otherwise they'd be using stone, which would be very much harder. But with knives, the bone making industry exploded. So here was a traditional craft that was even made greater by the use of iron tools. Many other objects were traded to the Indians, who brought pelts to the French. Next slide. And the pelts were given oftentimes to middlemen or to fur traders out in places like Chequamegon Bay, collected from the native people, put in huge birch bark canoes, and taken via rivers and portages to Quebec and Montreal. So this would have been a familiar, even up to about 1830 or 40, scenes like this would have been very common on Lake Superior. Not so many sailboats at that time, of course. But the voyageurs brought the packs, and they would go to Quebec, and then they'd pick up some fur trade goods, go back, trade with the native people, and so on. The fur trade became so valuable to native people that it caused wars for a long time, as native peoples themselves competed for attention of the Europeans in the fur trades. The Iroquois were especially ferocious and destroyed another whole tribal group called the Huron out in Georgia Bay because they were chief competitors. They literally just burned all their villages, and they sent them fleeing along with other people, for example, from what is now Michigan, sent them all fleeing into Wisconsin. And the Huron ended up here in Chequamegon Bay. And these other refugees ended up here in Chequamegon Bay. Well, good place to find resources, right? But also, it gave them a place also to carry out the trade which they needed to do. But the wars, the trade wars, I mean, if you could call them that, were disastrous for native people. They annihilated a lot of groups and so on. The fur trade also is disastrous in that diseases followed the fur trade routes. In 1770, I got that, you're right, a vicious smallpox epidemic was recorded for all of the north, including this area, that reportedly devastated the population. And these diseases were already devastating the population even before the Europeans themselves appeared, because they were following the middlemen. They were following the trade goods themselves and coming in there. So it was pretty much a catastrophe in that sense. Next slide. The first Europeans to come to Chequamegon Bay for the purposes of trade are not exactly recorded. We know that people were here before 1650. Next slide. This is pottery, by the way, broken pieces of pottery. Archaeologists specialize in broken pieces of pottery. We love broken pieces of pottery. Anybody can study a full pot, but it takes a real archaeologist to look at a small sherd and talk about it. But this pottery is from a place called the Cadat Site. And if we could just go back to the former slide, I just want to show you where it is. It's on Madeline Island, on the low tip, low, right there. And there was a site there that was excavated in the 1960s by Hamlin University, and they found all kinds of pottery and other items of native people who were here probably before 1650. Some of these may have been Ojibwa, but mostly Huron, that I talked about. Huron and another group called the Ottawa, who were important in the fur trade, but they were not from here. These are refugees coming already, or they were exploring the area to get pelts to take them to Quebec before the French came here themselves, so they're like middlemen and so on. So we have some good evidence. Some of the pottery is from a little bit later, when native people started to come here formally to trade, and some of the pottery is from as far away as Illinois. In fact, it was made by Illinois Indians, the tribe, Illinois tribe. Cree, a tribe you might have heard of in Canada, pottery is from Cree. It's a number of different tribal groups are represented on this one site that had to have been a gathering place, as Chequamegon now was becoming one of the major fur trade centers in North America. Next slide. Next slide. Radisson and Gossier, and I think I spelled that wrong, but that's okay, 1660 were the first French traders. They came and unfortunately, they left some memoirs and said they built cabins and traded with people, and also fanned out across the north, even supposedly into Canada and so on, looking for new sources of fur. And they came back to Quebec with a large amount of pelts, and that the French government immediately confiscated because they didn't have a permit. That sound familiar? They didn't have a license to do that. But it opened the eyes of New France and Quebec and Montreal, and this was followed very quickly by more traders and priests. Next slide. Several places have been suggested where Radisson built their cabins. There's some indication that it might have been Long Island, or as it was called, Chequamegon Point at the time. Other sources indicate it might have been near Ashland. In fact, there's a historic marker that says
It's a fact.
it's a fact. Yeah, yeah. I looked. You know, I thought, oh my God, I've been looking in this right here. Unfortunately, where it was all swamp. But yeah, and we know at the time there probably was an Ottawa Village somewhere on the mainland. And some people have suggested that was on Holton Point. But none of these, they're all based on very vague references, and some are contradictory. So as an archaeologist, I have been continually frustrated at trying to find some of these places. But anyway, those are candidates for where these were. Next. So the French had two interests in native peoples, and one was trade, of course, but the other was to save their souls. France was a Catholic country and had a strict Catholic tradition, and the dominant religious order were the Jesuits. How many people here studied under Jesuits? Any Jebbies? There you go. There you go, right there. I did too. The intellectuals of the religious orders, they're very learned men. They put a great value on education and so on. But they also dominated things in France to the point where they insisted the fur traders had to bring priests with them to convert the native people, to convert the indigenous people to Christianity, to bring them to God. And the fur traders are a rough lot and would do things like to give the Indians liquor in order to get the best of them and to entice them into the fur trade. So the Jesuits are always saying, no, no, no. So there's a great deal of tension between the fur traders and the Jesuits. But the Jesuits just set up, in Wisconsin, they set up two missions, special missions. By the way, the Jesuit is the guy in the black. For those of you who haven't studied under the Jesuits. Next slide. This is a 1600s map of the Great Lakes, basically, in New France. This is a French map that shows, boy, I don't have a pointer. Can you find Chouagambe?
Oh.
Yeah, right there, yeah, right there. And if you go up top there, that's what it says. The insert atop, yeah, right there. Point de Saint-Esprit, which is a point of the Holy Ghost. And it was a mission developed by a Father Alloway. And Alloway came here and he described his mission as being in between two large villages and two large native people. And he was followed 3 years later, or a couple of years later, by another distinguished Jesuit, Pierre Marquette. And it is where, this is, right here, this is where Marquette learned of the Mississippi River and eventually went to the Mississippi River to document that. And of course, and have a university named after him here in Wisconsin. The Alloway talked about large native people living here, two villages, but the villages were combined. The area now functioning as a fur trade center attracted people from further south, refugees again from the war, Iroquois wars, such as the Sauk, the Fox, among others, Miami, Illinois. All of these tribes were coming here, and not for vacation, can you imagine? Even with the weather as nice as it is today. Next slide. But here again, where were these missions? Where were the villages? And as I mentioned, one village was mentioned for, somebody theorized it was on Houghton Point. Others said the villages were at the bottom of the bay, where there's a great, the creek is called, just went on my creek at the bottom of the bay. Fish Creek? Yeah, Fish Creek, I'm sorry. Fish Creek. It's all swampy there, and we did, it had been suggested by early scholars that that's where the villages and the missions might be. And boy, we found nothing but water and mud, nothing. I mean, we surveyed there. But the missionaries, Alloway and Marquette, also emphasized that the people were planting corn. That when they came up here, they fished, traded, and planting corn. Now, if they're fishing, and they're planting corn, that seems to me to narrow the likelihood of where these were. It seems to me the area of Bad River, because that's where the Ojibwa planted their corn. That's one of the few places where you can plant corn, and that's where the fish weir is, and so on. So I suspect that they're still out there and they may be preserved. Others have suggested that the mission has been claimed by the lake, the rising water in the lake. But we continue the search for the missions and the villages. This is Father Alloway preaching. Next slide. French did later in the 18th century establish 2 posts on Madeline Island, one in 1693 and then one in 1718. The one was located apparently on Grants Point. Again, we haven't found that one, but we know where the other one was. Next slide. Because Henry Schoolcraft, I read a quote from him to start off my lecture. He came through at one point in the 1830s, and he tarried a bit on Madeline Island, and Chief Buffalo of the Ojibwa showed him where the old French fort was. And so Schoolcraft, in writing in his notebook, made a sketch. And what you see is a sketch of the fort, and it's just a sketch, but its relationship to a slough or a creek and Lake Superior. The fort was about 75 foot on a side, and we know a lot about this fort because of French correspondence, and it had been occupied by a number of commandants and was lost in 1760 when the English took over in a war against the French, of course, and this whole area became English. And the fort was apparently burned at that time. And they also wrote that right next to the fort was a very large Ojibwa village that had formed. Obviously, right next door to the store, and it became a permanent village between 1718 and about 1760. I know because we found that one. Next slide. Next slide. I guess we're going to go. This is not the fort. This is actually a later English one, but this is probably what it looked like, just to give an idea. Next slide. And Next slide. I'll just skip it. In the 1970s, we did extensive excavations on what we call the marina site because it is right next to the current marina on Madeline Island. They were putting in a sewer system. And we knew previous to that, well, the French fort was somewhere in the area. A mission established by Father Frederick Baraga in 1835 was somewhere in this area. And there were evidence of Native American habitations in this area. Before they put the sewer in, excavations actually took place along the sewer route to recover the material before it was going to be destroyed. Unfortunately, we didn't find the French fort, but as you can see, the excavations are in black. It's very narrow. I think we just missed it. We did find a piece of actual French pottery that gives us an idea, and so on. But we did find is a substantial evidence, a sample of a substantial Ojibwa village dating between 1715 and 1760. Next slide. Probably looks something like this. This is a Catlin painting. Looks like done by a kid, but this is a famous Catlinite painting of an Ojibwa village. So a wigwam, birch bark wigwam structures. We found evidence of circular or oblong wigwam structures because of black stains in the ground where the posts had been placed. And sometimes these would arc around, and sometimes they would have a burned area right in the center where they would have the fireplace and so on. And many other features. Next slide. This is a profile. This is excavated out of a storage pit. That's what it looks like. And so in the storage pit was garbage. When it was done being storage pit, they used it for garbage. And the garbage turned out to be lots of pieces of French trade goods and beads and other sorts of things that I talked about. Broken knives, cut up kettles, as well as other items that are clearly of native manufacture. A very, very wonderful site that gave us a great deal of insight into life at the times. Next slide. This is the excavation that's taking place right now. That's a woman in the pit, and she is now the director of the State Historical Society Museum. So she was 18 years old at this time. Isn't that nice? I promised her I would never show this picture again, but you won't tell her. But you can see the excavation in progress. Next slide. Among the most common objects were trade beads, very, very important to Native people. And if you're familiar with Ojibwa beadwork, it is fantastic. And this is where it started, is when these trade beads were coming during fur trade days, and these gave birth to this new art form, which was the floral and other designs. So this is a case where a trade good fostered creativity in the people that were receiving that. Next slide. The bottom are spear points, but they're made out of cut up kettles. The top, however, at the same time, they're still making arrow points from stone, and most of those are in top, so you get a combination of the two technologies, although the one on the furthest, on the right, is actually made from a gun flint. The gun flint came from France, but it was such a fine, the gun flints go in old style muskets, and this is such a fine object that they made it into an arrow point. And the person probably did not have a gun, had no use for a gun flint except to make fire. So it shows you kind of how these technologies were intermixed. Next line. One person who would have been born in this village was Chief Buffalo, the famous individual from the Red Cliff Reservation. He would have been born there. And he was buried right next to where we excavated in the cemetery that was established in 1835. Next slide. Which brings us to another mission era, and I'll be concluding in case you're watching the time. Our excavations also found remnants of Frederick Baraga's 1835 mission to the Ojibwa people. Frederick Baraga was from Austria and came to America along with other priests in Europe to convert native people. And he started out elsewhere in the Great Lakes, but came to La Point and began a mission to the Ojibwa people. What was highly successful in conversion with some of the Ojibwa, many of them who ended up in Buffalo's band. Buffalo himself evidently converted later on in age, but as the tradition goes, it was the Catholic Buffalo band people that went to Red Cliff during the residential area, and the other people went to Bad River. But he's very famous. He's got a lot of biographies written of him, and he has been recommended for canonization as a saint. Yeah, and so we got some soil samples from his mission area, so I wonder if that's holy dirt, you know, to see if it cures anybody. But true, because what they're studying right now are, you can't be canonized as a saint without proof of miracles. So they're studying that proof. One thing that they won't be able, one miracle they won't be able to prove, but a story told by Baraga is that he and his assistant were crossing the frozen bay from Madeline Island, probably going to the Ashland area or something, on a mission, and it was during winter, and they got stuck on an ice floe, and the wind was taking them out into Lake Superior. And so Father Baraga knelt down and prayed, and the wind shifted and brought the ice floe right to shore where they stepped out there. So won't be able to prove that one, but he has many followers, and people, he's actually, his country is Slovenia. It was part of Austria at the time, but Slovenians still come here as pilgrims and to visit Baraga. He's a national hero in Slovenia. And next slide, I think I can show you. Next slide. I'm going to go back, but next slide, just wanted to show you. He collected items from the Ojibwa people when he was here. And he sent them back and brought them back to Slovenia. And this was the start of the Slovenian Ethnographic Museum. And I didn't, when we were excavating site, I had no idea. But I've since been in contact, and they sent me these pictures of the things that the Ojibwa were making here in 1835. Beautiful pipes, look at the beadwork, moccasins, and so on. Go back. This is not the Point mission, but this is a different mission built by Baraga. But his mission on Madeline Island probably looked a great deal like this. And in fact, he describes it having a steeple, and he ordered a bell, and he wrote his supervisors all the time that he was starving because he essentially couldn't feed himself. This kind of mission wasn't a mission where the native people stayed and worked and to feed people. So he was pretty much by himself because the native people had a subsistence pattern that I described before. They couldn't sit there on Madeline Island the entire year. They'd starve. You have to go here for the fishing. You have to go here for the maple sugar. You have to be mobile. So he didn't have a whole lot of food, and he had to rely on the French-descended parishioners to feed him. But in any case, ultimately he became a bishop, and so on. Next slide. And I'll just rip through these. Next slide. This is just a map of our excavations that show that we found two things in the ground that were cellar basements. Now, those of you that go back probably remember cabins that had small cellars dug in below the floor for storage and whatsoever. And that's basically was the way you made cabins on Madeline Island in 1835, is you made them out of logs, and you had a stone chimney, and you dug a hole in the ground with a wood covering to store food, and that was your basement. So we found the cellar basements to these cabins. Next slide. And that's just what it looks like. You're looking at an excavation wall. So we dug down and we found logs that cribbed the cellar, and then in the background there, that's all was filled in. When the house was abandoned, when Braga abandoned it, they filled it in, and in the fill were stuff that was laying around. Artifacts galore, dating to Baraga's time. Next slide. Such as, these are drawings of blackboard slates. Baraga taught Ojibwa people, taught school, and he taught the students for a while, and was obviously using blackboard slates. But on the blackboard slates, you could still see where the students had made drawings so deep that they survived. So you see a man there, you see boats, yeah, a man and boats and stuff like that. Goes to show that even back then, students could not pay attention. They're doodling, making boats out in the bay and so on. But what a wonderful find, really helps you touch history. Next slide. And other dishware from the period, your animal bones, could tell what they're eating, or Baraga was eating, not much. Broken pieces of smoking pipes that the natives had made. And I suspect that even though he was collecting some of these, that these red pipestone pipes that were used in rituals displeased Baraga, and he may have acquired these to break these to show the dominance of the Christian religion, because these pipes were used in religious ceremonies, so I suspect that's why they were broken. But the coup de grace were these things. You can see a crucifix, pieces of rosaries, and a medal, both sides of a brass medal. The only one known in existence, but apparently he had visited, he went back to the home country on a visit and to raise money for his mission. And a local society supporting his work gave him a bunch of brass medals, religious medals, to distribute. And this is one of them. He went in, I think, 1836. And the brass medal is now clean, but on one side it has St. Catharina, and the other side another saint. But the St. Catharina is, his mother was named Catharina, and the other saint is special to Slavonians. So we have a medal from Slavonia that ended up in this filled-in cellar, kind of cinching that this was in fact Baraga's mission sites. These are now under a road. We were able to document those, and excavate that. But so this is one site. Of all the ones I talked about, we know the exact location, and from which we've learned quite a bit about. So I'm just going to end up by mentioning, next slide. Next slide, I'm going to skip to some, keep going. In 1837, 1842, and 1854, treaties were made with the Ojibwa people that ended up taking almost all their land. And the reason, one reason this happened is that the fur trade had died. And this was a source of goods for Native people. This was a source. By this time, many traditional crafts had been long forgotten. They really depended on these fur trade goods. But the fur trade ended. People in France and England were no longer buying beaver hats. And in any case, most areas had, most of the beaver had been killed. So the American Fur Trade Company, which was in charge at the dominated the trade at the time, shifted completely. They went basically out of the fur trade business and into fishing, commercial fishing. And throughout the Apostle Islands, there are places in which are the likely areas of American Fur Company fishing stations. And they employed Indians to help with that, because obviously they were great fishermen themselves. But even that went bust as a commercial venture eventually. And so the native people were in pretty dire straits, with a lot of game now gone because of large populations, no way to make money, to buy things or to trade for things. And the American government officials were actually encouraging the fur traders to get the Indians in debt, give them a lot of material up front, more than they could pay for in beaver pelts. And they were literally encouraging the fur traders to get them in debt so they'd be more inclined to sell their land. And so that's exactly what happened. And in 1854, that treaty, which was held at La Pointe here, 1842 treaty was held here too. The purpose of that treaty was to provide reservations, specific areas where the Ojibwa could live right now. And that, at that time, Bad River and Red Cliff reservations were designated for use by Native people, whereas before that, all of this was in fact on Native American land. This picture is after that, because after the 1854 treaty, the payments, they were given annual payments for the land in goods and cash. And these are called annuities. But they had to come in person to get them. And so Madeline Island was the place where Chippewa throughout the region were coming to get annuities. Earlier on, one tragic episode led to the fact that the Ojibwa were not removed completely and sent packing out west, was that they tried to trick the Ojibwa into going to a new place for some treaty payments, and the place is Sandy Lake, Minnesota. And they went there but the annuity payments didn't show up for a long time over winter, and neither did the food that thousands of Indians were supposed to eat while they're picking up their annuity. So no food, and they had to wait for the annuity payments, and so many people died of starvation or the cold during the winter. And when this got back to Washington, people were disgusted at that, and that has been evoked as one reason why the Ojibwa in this area were even able to keep reservations and not be totally removed. So it was not a good time, obviously, for the Ojibwa. But I'm going to end, I'm sorry, on that sad note, because a trajectory here of the fur trade in general was one of increasing stress for both sides, but especially Native American people. But with this, I think you can see what an important place you live in, historically speaking. And also, of all the things that are out there that can be discovered. 2 years ago, an artifact collector called me and showed me some artifacts, in fact, that all date to the 1790s. And he said that they were found on Houghton Point. So it's one site that we're in fact going to be examining close, but it's a new fur trade site. We don't know who was there, 1790, 91. It could be a person named Michelle Cadat from Madeline Island, whose wife was Madeline, and or it could be another fur trader named John Johnson, who was just here for a year. So that's an example of things that are kind of popping up that require more investigation. So I hope I haven't exceeded my limit too long, and I'll certainly be able to answer any questions.